With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness enclosing my mind, enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. So, in the context of our study of Treasury of Precious Qualities, we're looking at the bodhicitta of application, in which essentially we're studying the 6 paramitas. And this means that we've covered generosity, discipline, patience, endeavor, meditation, and presently we're studying wisdom. Now, wisdom is really a big topic. It's essentially wisdom that cuts through our delusion. So whatever we're doing in the Buddhist teaching, it's about cutting through delusion. And we are deluded from the point of view that we simply don't understand. You could say we don't understand ourselves, and we don't understand what we're perceiving. In fact, we are misunderstanding everything. We're misperceiving. And that's where the Buddha, he saw that on the basis of misperceiving things and stuck in this delusional condition, we suffer. Now, the Buddha didn't teach because he thought we were, you could say, bad philosophers or bad mathematicians. But the Buddha saw that we are suffering on account of simply just not, you could say, being aligned with reality. And so the Buddha really just wanted us to see. You know, in the Buddhist teaching, we talk about vipassana, which really means greater perspective of greater seeing. And that is what we're doing with the cultivation of wisdom. We're simply just opening our eyes. You know, it's a bit like when we wake up in the morning, we're not being told what we're supposed to see. We're just no longer caught in the dream. So the Buddha's not about to tell us, this is what you're supposed to see, this is what you're supposed to believe, and so on. The Buddha is just providing a path in which we can eliminate this cause of suffering, which is simply that we're lost. We're lost in confusion. And we already, you could say, possess everything that's needed for us to no longer be confused. But the Buddha needs to give us a nudge and just point out, you know, there's some things that just aren't the way that you think they are. Things aren't solid the way that we tend to think they are. To note that the core element of what really drives our insanity, the reason why we get plunged into the painful confusion that we call samsara, is simply because of our not understanding what's there and actually getting all wound up in a very painful place that we call self, solidifying our experience into something small. And that's where we get terribly painful and neurotic. At the other end of this spectrum, there's freedom. And so the Buddha really just was teaching us what is our, you could say, the way to get from a painful place into the condition of freedom. And that's the path. And the path is really just, you could say, therapy, in which we are introduced to the understanding of what is and what isn't. And the large part of the Buddha's teaching is this critical investigation into what really is. And on the basis of seeing that how our confusion projects solidity onto ourselves and solidity onto the phenomenal world, the Buddha introduces us to a wider perspective. And this is where, on the basis of that understanding, we can then practice the path. Now, in terms of then how this proceeds in this chapter, we actually talk about 3 kinds of wisdom. There's the wisdom that comes from us being exposed to the words of the Buddha, to the teaching, just like if we're listening to somebody who knows their way around town. Then if we're just sitting as an academic and saying, oh, this is how the town is, that's fine, but it doesn't really touch us. But if we're somebody who's actually going somewhere, if it actually means something to us, then we not only listen, but we also make sure that we understand it and that we then are aware of, we're going to be doing this. So that's where we need to actually click with what's being said. And that's what we call the wisdom resulting from reflection. And then actually going there, traveling, that's what you could say is the wisdom resulting from meditation. That's where we integrate this knowledge. So that's where we talk about three kinds of wisdom, so three kinds of prajnas. Presently, we're in the first, and we're looking at what it is we need to understand. Then we need to integrate this with our insight into ourselves and understanding humbly, where is it that we're deluded? Where is it that we have a potential for being free, and what are the conditions that will take us there? So that's where we then become very informed. Unless we are informed, then it's very difficult for us to go anywhere. We could be very spiritually inclined, but if we're just sort of sitting around and doing some meditation without actually knowing where it is we're going, then we're a bit lost. Just the other day, I was listening to a tune by George Harrison, and the title of the track was, "If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there," which essentially means when you don't know where you're going and you just keep going, yes, for sure, you'll get somewhere, but there's no guarantee that this is where it's valuable. And that's why, when Sansa Kangyur Rinpoche was teaching the introduction to the middle way, he so emphasized the importance of knowing where it is we're going, to have the map. And then, yes, then we can proceed. Then we can say, when we see landmarks and so on, we know that we're on the right track. So presently we're looking then at, and I'm going to take a departure in, well, let's look at the verse that we're presently studying. But actually last time we ended with one of us, Anas, asking, what is existence, according to the various ways that we understand them? And that was a really good question. And I said, I'd rather wait with that. It was just at the question and answer period at the end. And I said, we'll start with that next time. And actually looking at the text, that's perfect, because that's just what the next section of the text is all about. So in that sense, it makes sense to begin with that. So I'll just read the root text from Jigme Lingpa. And Jigme Lingpa then says, able to examine and contest the views of all the lower schools, this is the supreme way and free from all mistake. Knowing thus the character of different tenets, deriving as these do from varying beliefs, the wisdom that can well discern the true position, and that which is in harmony, and that which disagrees, depends upon one's hearing of the teaching. And that's where we then have essentially been going through what we call the tenet systems. And the tenet systems are sometimes understood as something terribly abstract and philosophical, but actually they're not. They're really just, you could say, increasingly sophisticated views on our reality. But that's where the question of existence comes in. I don't know if last time I was warmly recommend to follow Khenchen Pema Sherab's teachings on the lion's roar, on extrinsic emptiness that he's been giving these days in Portugal, and where Wilson Fletcher has been giving the revision class later in the day. And in there, Wilson was pointing out how existence is this big thing in Western philosophy. And of course, existence is really where we go wrong. We attribute existence to something that doesn't have existence. And that's where at the lower tenet systems, then they would break things down and say, our suffering comes from attributing existence to what is in fact just material composite. If I'm attached to my watch, voila, then when it breaks down or it gets hammered or whatever and doesn't work, then I'm deeply distraught. And that's where somebody would come in and say, you know what, it was nothing but just an assemblage of parts. I was thinking about this the other day when in the news, there was this kid There was some kid in a museum who had knocked over some 3,500-year-old amphora, some, beautiful old vase from, Mesopotamia or somewhere like that. Of course, that made the headlines. And that's where, in fact, if we actually have the wisdom, we might have a priceless Ming vase. And then, we're more attached to that than, let's say, our family or whatever. We're just so attached to it. We actually, and that's where wisdom comes in and sees, yes, you're attributing existence to something that is, in fact, just, if you hammer that vase down, it's nothing but just, particles. And that's where, at the level of the Vibhashikas, they speak about how everything is just particles, and how our experience of self, which we say, oh, there's an ongoing, continuous sense of me, is in fact just moment by moment by moment by moment, where we're, you could say, sustaining a particular narrative, we're sustaining a particular storyline, but in fact, there is nothing but moment by moment by moment. And that's where, if we then understand that, when we then meditate, and we actually begin to let go of our assumptions around things, then that message seeps in. And that's where we have the views according to these different tenets. So the Vibhashikas, they're the one who look at the, you could say, the constructed nature of objects, and say they're nothing but just, they're made up of particles. And that's also what your physics teacher back in school would have told you. And similarly also with consciousness. And that actually might not be what your psychologist or what you've been thinking your mind was, because we do think, oh, it's me, 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 me. And of course, yes, we understand that in the Buddhist teaching, but we also say, try and have a look. There is, in fact, nothing but just present moments in which we are sustaining memories and belief systems, moment for moment for moment. And of course, this is deeply ingrained, and we do talk about the ways in which this happens. But if we investigate, we won't find anything. And that's where then the Vibhashikas, they would say, well, there's just singular moments of consciousness. But then the other tenet systems, they go a bit further. You have the Srotantikas, which acknowledge that whatever we perceive, we're really just looking at our own projections on the objects. And that's also a way where they go into, you could say, a deeper perspective. Then you have the Yogacharya, which understands that whatever we're perceiving happens to be it's just going through the mind. It's the mind that creates this sense of I. It's the mind that creates our world. And many of us might have suspected that, and we might have come across that kind of, you could say, perspective and think, oh, that's cool. But the thing is, in the teaching, it's more than we just say it's cool. We actually really substantiate this kind of proposition with actually logic investigation. And then finally, we have but there we would say the Yogacharya, as they sometimes are defined at least, hold on to some solid consciousness as being absolute, a mind that is absolute. They understand even the so-called extra-mental phenomena are in fact just constructed by the mind. But that's where then, at least in the Tibetan, you could say, tenet systems, Yogacharyas are seen to hold on to some solid mind. And that's where the Madhyamikas, they would come in and simply say there is absolutely nothing that has any kind of autonomous reality at all. There is a web of causes and conditions that apply to both our sense of subject and the perception of object and so on. But there's nothing that has any, you could say, the concrete reality. And so what I'm doing here, as you can hear, is a little bit of sort of a summary, but that's also implicit in the fact that we're now looking at the conclusion and what's going to be talked about here. But that's also where we ended last time, where we then looked at the Madhyamikas that understand that there is nothing that has any reality apart from simply just there's labeling that takes place on the basis of our perceptions. But in fact, what is there is nothing but a web of causes and conditions. And so that's where you have two kinds of Madhyamikas, and those that would say, well, conventionally, things do seem very real. And I think most of us can kind of agree with that. But of course, on the absolute, yes, then there is nothing that has any reality. And this way, what we call the Svatantrika Madhyamika, they accommodate two perspectives. One is that sort of relatively, yes, there's a reality, even though in the ultimate, there is no reality whatsoever. And that you could say is a very helpful way to approach it. And that's what in most of the Buddhist teaching, we have what's called the two truths. You know, on one hand, you have what appears, and then there's the actual reality once we begin to analyze and to look and to see that actually there is the solidity that we thought was there is actually absent. So in this way, these two truths, they apply in all of the tenets, actually. But particularly then with the Svatantrika Madhyamikas, they completely are in sync with the absolute perspective, but on the relative level, they understand how phenomena appear. Some Svatantrika Madhyamikas would say they appear on the basis of some solid phenomena out there. And some would say it's just the relative phenomena that we perceive is just really the mind. And then they agree with the Yogacarya. And this is significant for us because in the Nyingma teachings, particularly, actually, we subscribe to the Svatantrika Madhyamika from the perspective of understanding how perceptions arise, just like they do in the Yogacarya. But like I also mentioned last time, in the 11th century, there was an important work on Madhyamika that was transmitted to Tibet, and essentially the lineage of somebody called Chandrakirti. And this really became very, you could say, dominant in Tibetan Buddhism. And that is what then was referred to as the Prasangika Madhyamika. And this is where we ended last time. And really what is significant about the Prasangika Madhyamika, particularly for people who are practicing the great perfection, is that the Prasangika Madhyamika, they would say, well, two truths, that's still just according to the conventional mind. All there is reality. And of course, we have a sort of an ordinary reality that we perceive, but that we simply just perceive as it's not normally perceived. We don't philosophize about it. All there is in reality is this Dhammadhatu, the freedom from conceptual constructs. And it's sort of all Chandrakirti does is really just deconstruct, dismantle our assumptions about reality. And that, you could say, is the final word. And everyone in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition agrees on that. At the same time, it's very high. It's very advanced. And that's why we sometimes would say, well, it makes sense to also have some explanation about what it is we're perceiving. That's where what we also looked at, it can be very helpful to have that approach that we find in the Svatantrika Madhyamika. So anyway, then coming back to the whole idea of existence really is where we are attributing solidity to something that actually doesn't have solidity. Anyway, let me just then see what I felt compelled to just give a little bit of a summary of where we've come to in terms of this. And I think maybe for some of you, this might be also a little bit helpful to sort of go over this. And I would say, please don't for a moment think that this is just philosophy for philosophy's sake. It is really about something that we live with every micro moment of our existence. And that's why this is significant in terms of our journey to awakening, where the path, the methods that we are practicing, they're intended to facilitate that we see what is being talked about here. So Kangyur Rinpoche says the proponents of the three lower tenet systems, and with that he means the Prabhashika, the Sotrantika, and the Yogacarya, impute existence to phenomena. That means they say even if you break appearances down, like the vase, like the 3,500-year-old vase, if you break it down, if you take your clock and break it down, if you take your Ming vase or just your teacup, your mug, and hammer it, you can see that it comes undone. All composite phenomena are impermanent. And that's where in some of the tenet systems, they would make a point about how there is something that's still there. There's some sort of foundation. And that's also what's basic to, you could say, our science right up to this day, or at least up until now. Then there has been largely the assumption that there was a foundation. This, of course, is coming a little bit undone in recent time. But in any way, this is what defines the lower tenet systems. They are what we call substantialists, ngubomauer in Tibetan. So they impute some foundation, some existence to phenomena. Kangyur Rinpoche says they do indeed manage to overcome certain conceptual constructions by reflecting on the absence of self. So that's why if you begin to analyze this subject and you begin to see, in fact, this is all just aggregation, then you actually begin to let go this sort of idea of me being the center of the universe, me being this, what lies at the center of all our hopes and fears. You begin to let go of that. And that's where already there, these views are very significant. So that's where they actually help us get over so they reflect on the absence of self. They understand the unborn nature, emptiness, and the absence of ontological extremes. What we mean with that is simply beliefs, philosophical position, dogmatic positions. And all of these, you can say, insights or lack of insights, they are what it says here, which are the very object of wisdom inquiry. So again, what we mean with wisdom is that which cuts through our assumption. So that's why we investigate things. Are they really what they appear to be? Now, regarding these three lower tenets, Kangyur Rinpoche says, but they still retain a certain clinging to the reality of things. The Svatantrikas, for their part, accept existence on the conventional level. So now we're going into the Madhyamika. And the first of the Madhyamikas then, which is sort of ranked under the Prasangika, are the Svatantrikas. And then it says here, these, for their part, they're Madhyamikas, but it says here, they accept existence on the conventional level. So they still have something to say about the conventional. And particularly then in the case of Shantrakshita, that's where one would then say, well, everything that we experience is the mind. It's projections of the mind. It's on the basis of the imprints on our alaya. Then there are the various karmic phenomena that construct these life worlds that we refer to as the 6 realms of samsara. So they talk about the relative level. But of course, the final word with regards to the nature of reality, and if we really want to understand that, is that we need to let go even the concepts that objectify phenomena as having some even conventional existence. And that's where the Prasangika is significant. And that's where Kangyur Rinpoche then says, it is only the Prasangikas who contest such assertions, uprooting all extremes of conceptuality. So that's where they don't take prisoners, nothing's left. And that's where, you could say, for the practitioners of the highest level then, who are not concerned about appearances, who dwell in the ultimate, for such practitioners, yes, then this makes perfect sense. It says here, Kangyur Rinpoche says, being immune to counterattack, the Prasangika tenets are supreme. They are the summits of all systems and utterly free from error. And if you look at then Chandrakirti's work, which Tsongtse Khyentse Rinpoche actually taught on several occasions, then Chandrakirti, and quoting Nagarjuna, is not interested in doing philosophy. He is only interested in actually dismantling philosophy. And so any of these sort of philosophical positions, these so-called ontological extremes, Chandrakirti dismantles, or Nagarjuna dismantles. And that's why they don't stand back and say, our philosophy is the best. They dismantle all philosophical positions. And then we could say, but that is a pretty cool philosophy, isn't it? But that's only what we call the Majjhimika of words. And of course, what they are, they're like the Buddha pointing to the moon. They're trying to get us out of our heads, so to speak. They're trying to get us out of our belief systems. I just want to, yes, here, do I have it here? Just want to show you, let's just see if I have it here, yes. This is Nagarjuna's praise of the Buddha, which we find at the beginning of what's called the Mula Majjhimika Karika, the verses, the root verses of the middle way. And that is generally seen as, for good reason, I can tell you, good reason, considered a rather dense philosophical work. But it is, you could say, beautiful in terms of it really is the ultimate, you could say, blow to philosophy, dogma, and all, you could say, the referential positions that hold us down in samsara. And that's where Nagarjuna, he starts off saying, praising the Buddha, he says, to him who taught that things arise dependently. And what we mean with that then, coming back to Anas's question from last time, that is when we say things don't have an existence, in the sense that they appear for sure, but they don't exist unconditionally. And not having something solid about them, we say they don't have existence. They are merely part of a web of causes and conditions. They are dependent arising. Sometimes we say interdependent arising. Now, sometimes actually this interdependent arising gets a sort of a funny interpretation because it's a tough one. And so it seems that in some quarters of the Buddhist world, people have taken this dependent arising or interdependent arising to mean, oh, we're all connected. You know, we're all holding hands. We're all part of the greater one. We're all connected together. And that's a very sweet thought. And that's definitely sort of also what runs the spirit that runs through the Mahayana understanding of the conventional experience of rebirth, which necessarily takes place on the basis of a set of parents. And that's where we would say there's not a single being who we are not connected through having been child of a particular set of parents, or, you know, who we have been parents to. And that's why everybody else matters. But this sort of interpretation of constructing dependent arising as meaning that we're all connected together has nothing to do with what is taught in the Buddhist teaching, actually. But it's a nice thought. But what we really mean with dependent arising is emptiness. You know, I don't think people who like to think, oh, we all belong together, you know, that this is supposed to mean that we should get rid of our, you could say, naive assumptions about the reality of things. That's what it's the antidote for. Anyway, so that's where we praise the Buddha for actually sort of taking us out of our shell, opening us up and saying things don't have the reality they appear. And that's why we investigate things, we say, oh, they really only exist on the basis of being constructed. They're there as, you could say, dependent phenomena. And that's also why they're impermanent. That's why they don't have a self and so forth. So to him who taught that things arise dependently, not ceasing, not arising, not annihilated, nor yet permanent, not coming, not departing, not different, not the same. The stilling of all thought and perfect peace, to him the best of teachers, perfect Buddha, I bow down. And that's where the Buddha is a bit like, some of you maybe remember, Kangyur Rinpoche, he gave a teaching called Life as Cinema. And that's a bit like where we sit in the cinema and we are very caught up in the plot. You know, we're sitting there going through boxes of Kleenex, or we're sort of terrified, or we're completely caught in the plot. And then the Buddha comes and taps us on the shoulder and says, hey, it's really just pixels on a screen. It's not real. It's not really happening. And then we sort of go, oh, yes. that doesn't make the thing stop, but it just enables us to all of a sudden realize it doesn't have the reality that we think it do. And same with the dream. You know, in the dream, we become incredibly attached or incredibly fearful. But when we wake up, we realize it's not as if the whatever, if we're being chased by a tiger or we are having a child that dies or whatever it might be, everything that appears in the dream has never actually come into existence. So it's not as if they go away. It's not like the tiger goes away or the child revives or anything. It's simply that these things, in that they haven't been born, in the sense that they haven't come into existence, there's no going out of existence. So that's why we say here, not ceasing, not arising, not annihilated, nor yet permanent, not coming, not departing, not different, not the same. All of these, you could say, attributions that we sometimes have of things as being this or that and so on, these are what that drive our agitation, our anguish, our suffering. And it keeps us, you could say, alienated from reality. It keeps us held back in a small space. What the Buddha wants us is to break out of the small space. And that's why we would say in that selfless space, we set free the warmth of love. We set free the natural strength. We set free the wisdom that is not confused. And so all the enlightened qualities comes from, you could say, this wisdom that cuts through our confusion and essentially takes us out of a shell. And that's where you could say genuine compassion then is not about I am compassionate to somebody else, but rather it's just the natural unfolding of non-dual engagement with the phenomena, with others. So that's where this is so important. So anyway, that's where we then would say that this wisdom is extremely important. And when it comes to seeing the highest review, really, we praise the Prasangika in terms of their providing, you could say, the last blow to any kind of reference point. Okay. Now, this is part of the conclusion, and that's where now what now follows is going to be more along the lines of the sort of outline of the history and so on. So I'll just take some questions if there are. So thank you, Sam. And then there's a gentleman called Matt who's asking, as I understand it, a Buddha's mind is beyond concept. But wouldn't concepts be required in order to produce action? Like beings who are suffering is a concept. Or is a Buddha's mind an activity entirely spontaneous and free from volition based on concept? The latter. There is sometimes some debates around, does the Buddha have bodhicitta or not? But we generally would say that it is simply in the absence of confusion. There's no longer this sort of retraction into the place of a self, and there's the spontaneous unfolding of Buddha activity. Another great text that Tongsa Khyentse Rinpoche taught over a number of years was the Uttara Tantra Shastra, which essentially explains the nature of Sugatagarbha or Buddha nature. And in there we would say the Buddha nature, when it's no longer veiled. And we have some examples also of how it's veiled. I'm sure you've heard, like a treasure buried under a poor person's house, like honey in a beacon, like a statue in a mold, like a jewel in the mud, and so on, where we would say all the Buddha nature is perfect, but it's just veiled, and we don't know it. And that's where, when this is no longer veiled, we would say that Buddha activity is tak hyap lundrup in Tibetan, permanent, all-pervasive, and spontaneous. So that's where you're saying here, or is the Buddha's mind and activity entirely spontaneous and free from volition based on concept? And I have to say, yes, that is exactly what it is. But up until a very fine level, of course, the Bodhisattva still operates with, you could say, in the appearance of duality. You know, up until the highest level, then the Bodhisattva will still think, I'm helping sentient beings. But what really defines the Buddha and why we honor the Buddha, of course, is there's freedom from that. Otherwise, like I'm often sort of giving that sort of absurd example that we might think of, then the Buddha, the Bodhisattva, or the Dalai Lama, or the teacher is sitting up there thinking, oh, I'm so wonderful. I'm helping sentient beings, you know. And what's so wonderful about the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas and, say, our teachers is there's not that self-consciousness. There's not that, hey, you owe me. I'm helping you a lot, you know. I'm taking a Bodhisattva vow and I'm going to be coming back. Damn it. You know? And that's where also we have this famous story of Avalokiteshvara, who at one point, saving sentient beings for eons and eons, looks back and thinks, my God, there's still sentient beings. And that's where, at the level of the Bodhisattva, there's still this sort of like, oh my God, there's still more to do. And we would actually say it was when Avalokiteshvara broke through this, you could say, somewhat pedestrian, even though compared to us, a very high and noble level. But even so, Avalokiteshvara had a breakthrough of that, you could say, very literal understanding of his commitment. That is then that he manifested with the 1,000 arms and the 11 heads and so forth, that there was broke free from that.
Is there any understanding as to what veil it was lifted in order to produce that effect within the Bodhisattva?
Yes, the cognitive veil. So, you know, we talk about the most basic veil that we have is the fundamental delusion that posits then this sort of unconscious place where we begin to think I in relation to what we perceive. And that's where we begin to say I and other. And it's on the basis of that that another veil develops, which is I in relation to the other is continually seeking to get pleasure from the object and continually trying to avoid displeasure. And that's where we then have the origins of self versus other with the accompanying attachment and aversion. And that's where we then, from that, we then have the kleshas. And once the kleshas are acted upon, and this is then the second veil, the second obscuration are then the kleshas. Then when that becomes a habit, and it begins to become ingrained and begins to actually be what creates our reality, that's when we talk about the veil of karma. And in that sense also we talk about the habitual patterns that we're continually following. So we talk about four veils, which are then the veils, the most fundamental veil that you could say it's then that which Avalokiteshvara broke through, which is the cognitive veil. Shedya Dripa in Tibetan. And then you have the emotional veil, Nyönmön Dripa. And then you have the karmic veil, Leki Dripa. And then finally you have the habitual patterns, Bhaktari Dripa. So these veils then obscure our Buddha nature, and that's what wisdom breaks through. Okay. Shall we have a little bit look at the next part? Okay, let's go for it. So 138. Now, it refers to our wisdom of hearing. And it says here, it expels defilement, and on the undefiled, the demons have no hold. What here is comprehended is the fundamental nature of phenomena, unspeakable, unthinkable, the final truth that cannot be expressed. So this we often hear, how obviously the nature of reality, the Dhammadhatu and so on, is beyond conceptual constructs. It's beyond language, it's beyond thought. Kangyur Rinpoche says, in India, there were many philosophical systems, both Buddhist and non-Buddhist. Likewise, in Tibet, numerous distinctions were made according to respective beliefs, and there are several ways of comprehending the teachings of the proponents of the Madhyamika and the secret mantra. From their own standpoint, and according to their own understanding, the proponents of each of these systems claim finality for their own tenets. So that's why we would then, in the various philosophical, you could say, classifications, there would be individuals who would say, this is what we hold as absolute. But I would also say it's important for us when we talk about these various philosophical systems, or tenets as we call them, that we keep that to just being classifications. And we don't begin to point the finger and saying, oh, these guys out there in that monastery, they hold to that belief. Or these guys over there, they hold to that belief, These guys, they're Hinayana, because they hold the Vibhashika and Sutantika views, I don't think, if there's living people out there, I don't think they like to be called Hinayana. So that's where we need to be clear that when we're talking about the various, you could say, tenet systems, then this is really just, you could say, ways that they're actually something that we all go through. I mean, we all do believe in that things have particles, and we can't actually see beyond that anyway. So we shouldn't really be too up ourselves in terms of the higher and the lower. And in fact, they all apply. And we all operate with a conventional material reality. So in fact, we're no better than any, you could say, tenet system. But you do then have debates. And of course, that did happen. And in India also, you had debates that took place. And still, the Tibetans were very good in that sense, because they kept these debates going, basically to just make sure that you weren't just sort of like sleepily just subscribing to whatever, whatever Guruji says. That's just dandy. That's where that sort of investigation really prompts a certainty in what it is that becomes the foundation for our practice, for our view. So Kangyur Rinpoche continues, but if one analyzes them all in detail and gains a proper understanding of them through the wisdom arising from hearing the teachings, it is possible to differentiate clearly the character of the four main systems of Buddhist thought and achieve certainty that the ultimate path of practice is that of the Prasangikas. And that's where we can then see why the Prasangikas are, you could say, supreme when we've studied the others. And in fact, we can say about the Prasangikas, what the final word really is that Prasangikas actually don't offer a philosophy. What they do is they provide a critique. This is something Wilson Fletcher, he quotes an Indian scholar called Murti. But the reality of Prasangika is that they don't have a viewpoint, because they're just critiquing any philosophical view. And that is the beauty of it. That's where, famously Nagarjuna said, I have no flaw because I have no position. Anyway, it's to just sort of adopt that like that. Oh yeah, I have no, I have no concepts. I have no this philosophical position, without actually knowing what it is that you're free of, would become a very lazy approach to this. And that's where it's so helpful to actually have a gradual view on how this is how we can approach our perceptions and gradually sort of arrive at a deeper understanding of what our reality is made from. Now, that's, again, praising the Prasangikas here, who they being Madhyamikans, then they are juxtaposed to the Svatantrikas, who are the ones who then, they explain relative truth, but they still agree at the absolute level with the Prasangikas. And that's why it says here, while the Svatantrikas are in harmony with the Prasangika position, the Vibhashikas, Sotrantikas, and Chittamatrans diverge from it. So that's where we're essentially saying Svatantrikas, yeah, as much as they do explain relative truth, they're cool, because they don't assume there is any ultimate foundation. Now, the other guys, Vibhashikas, Sutrantikas, and Chittamatrans, they have very sophisticated analysis of phenomena, but they still attribute some foundation. So, conviction in this matter goes far beyond the manipulation of mere words and expressions. So that's where it doesn't help that we're very clever at explaining this. It has to be something that we bring to our intimate analysis of ourselves and our personal experience, and seeing how this actually aligns with what we experience. So that's where ultimately it is about pointing to what goes beyond concepts and language. It says, it is the wisdom resulting from reflection, which itself derives from the wisdom from perfectly hearing the teachings. So we first need to hear, and then we need to apply it. Again, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And that's where, if we're saying, famously men, they don't like to ask for directions. So this is sort of one of these jokes, right? That you're sometimes here. But anyway, if we're the kind of person who we don't want to ask directions, we'll find it, But then, eventually you might not find it, and then where it is actually quite helpful to then say, somebody says, you go here and then you hang a left, and they, and then you actually, oh, okay, and that's where hearing the teachings can actually, open up for a lot of insight. So that's where these two come together, that you have the wisdom that comes from reflection, you could say personal insight and reflection that, again, necessarily is based on the guidance from the teachings, and that's from the wisdom arising from hearing the teaching. And then when we actually do go down that road there, when we do hang a right and say, oh my God, now we're here, this works. That's where then we talk about, through meditation on the meaning thus understood, traveling the way, the perfect wisdom that accurately ascertains phenomena, and knowing what is reality, will subdue all negative emotions and thought patterns that fixate upon the supposed reality of things. And that is where we get out of this rut that we're in, where we're attributing existence to that which doesn't have existence. We simply begin to see what there is, rather than fixating on the thoughts and you could say, emotional reactive patterns that hold us in a particular condition of obscuration. So with that wisdom then, the wisdom of meditation based on the other two wisdoms, it says it will banish them from the mind, meaning these veils, and an immense courage will rise in the face of evil and adversity, which in turn will be rendered powerless. So that's the tremendous value in terms of this when we're traveling the path. So I think we'll stop here, and let's just see if there's. It says here, from the relative point of view, the cognition of individual self is considered valid or invalid cognition. Very good question. From the relative point of view, yes. And that's where we then would say relative point of view, we would actually say we have relative valid cognition that can be valid in terms of, we can see, for example, math, 2 + 2 is 4. That's valid. 2 + 2 being 5 is invalid. And also sometimes we would say, in philosophy and epistemology, they say you stick a stick in the water, a straight stick into the water, and when you're looking at the water from above, it looks as if it's bent. And that's where we do have invalid cognition within relative truth. Now, I have said that to give some idea of what we mean with valid and invalid cognition. But actually, and I almost hate to say this, but from the relative point of view, we would say that we would say from the relative point of view, this watch exists because there is something that is seen as being actually there. There's some things there that constitute a watch. And as such, there's a dependent arising of the watch. I have to say, actually, the individual self, which is attributed to what we then call the aggregates, the skandhas, is actually seen as being invalid relative truth. But for the time being, it seems to be very real for us. So even though it is a veil, it is that which really is you could say, the big challenge on the journey. And that's where we do establish the view that actually the individual self actually has no existence whatsoever. It's an entirely delusional condition. So that's where, as far as relative phenomena go in general, we could say there's a mistaken and unmistaken understanding of the relative, but actually the belief in a self is actually mistaken relative truth. But that's one that persists for a very long time. So I hope that's helpful. That is the fundamental delusion that we're dealing with, and also the self that we attribute to phenomena. Same thing. The phenomena appear as a web of causes and conditions, and that we can say is how appearances take place. But the solidity that we attribute to it is actually delusional. All right, we'll conclude with some dedication. Okay. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together.